All right, so welcome. This is our question and answer session for this week of classes. So some good questions. Generally, good job on the quizzes. I appreciate that. So the first question or set of questions deals with this issue of third parties. So the first, a general one: how are these new parties able to gain so much influence and power today when third parties almost don't exist today? Even though we're still in this very polarized period. And then a second question on the Free Soil Party, and I think there's a linkage here between the two. So I thought I'd talk just a little bit more about the Free Soil Party and then answer the underlying question in both of these. So Free Soil is a party that is sort of an outgrowth of a smaller abolitionist party called the Liberty Party, which was around in 1844. Free Soil is a broader party, and its constituency, it turns out, is disproportionately northern. Well, that's obviously not a surprise, but also disproportionately ex-Democrat. So it runs candidates, excuse me, in the 1848 and 1852 presidential elections. In 1848, the Free Soil nominee is Martin Van Buren, former Democratic president who had succeeded Andrew Jackson. And in 1852, the Free Soilers nominate this guy here on the right, John Hale, who was a Democratic senator from New Hampshire, a strong opponent of slavery in the territories in the debates from the Mexican War. Van Buren, unsurprisingly, does better than Hale does. I mean, in Van Buren, we have a former president. In Hale, we have a senator from a relatively small state. But even Hale gets around 5% of the vote. And the people who vote for these candidates, these are in some ways ex-Democrats. So to a certain extent, you can see the Free Soil Party as a kind of way station party where you have Democrats from the North who are concerned about the issue of slavery moving to the Free Soil Party, and then eventually, as John Hale will, they move over to the Republican Party. So that's one, I think, general significance of Free Soil, and the strength of the Free Soil Party really puts the abolition issue, puts the slavery and the territory issue on the national agenda in a way that it's much harder for presidential candidates to ignore. And then secondly, we have this issue of how is it that in our current environment where third parties just don't seem possible, why is it different in 1848, 52? And there is a reason for this. So this is the 1848 map, and I had shown this in one of the snippets for this week. So the purple here are the Whigs, the blue are the Democrats. Van Buren doesn't carry any states, but he nonetheless wins 10% of the vote. That is an extremely deceptive 10%, because you figure in basically any slave state. So let's move south of Maryland down to Florida, over to Texas, Missouri, and Arkansas. Van Buren's vote is basically zero. So in the North, Van Buren is getting 18-20% of the vote. There's a significant chunk of Northern voters who are in favor of Van Buren. And that's a problem for both of these parties, but ironically, more so for the Whigs than the Democrats. The Whigs can kind of see it from this map. They're a very interesting party in lots of ways, but they're a party that's built on this idea of compromise. They have a northern wing, they have a southern wing. Their northern wing tends to disproportionately attract abolitionists. The southern wing wants to just sort of avoid the slavery issue altogether. But the Whigs are a party. It's going to be difficult for them to survive if slavery becomes a central issue. So contrast 1848 with 1852, and you can see the purple states basically, wither away and die. So one reason why the Republicans become a successful third party, and we also have this weird situation with the Know Nothings and the American Party as a fourth party, is that a political system that had been built on two parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, who were intent on avoiding slavery and were bisectional parties, suddenly all of American politics becomes sectionalized in the 1850s, and first the Whigs, and then to a certain extent the Democrats, because remember the Democrats split into two in 1860, can't survive. And it is in that kind of environment that a third party becomes possible. But of course, recall the fourth party, the American Party, withers away and dies. So even in this system, it's difficult for a third party to emerge. let's hope that we're not in for another civil war anytime soon. But the fact that it takes the run up to a civil war to shake the two-party system and to allow for a third party to emerge, as occurred in the run up to the civil war, is a reminder of just how difficult it is in an electoral college system for this kind of thing to occur. Second question: why did James Buchanan nearly trigger war with Paraguay? Which it really is. It's one of the stranger episodes in American diplomatic history. The reason is not Paraguay. Buchanan wasn't particularly concerned with Paraguay. The reason was that Buchanan envisioned a robust executive role in Latin America. He was a supporter of U.S. expansion in Latin America. Although ironically, most of the Southerners wanted expansion because they saw increased slave states. With Buchanan, it was more strategic, but at the end of the day, it really didn't matter. So the goal here for Buchanan was to create a precedent involving a Latin American country that clearly would not be the subject of annexation. I mean, the U.S. was not going to annex Paraguay, but to have that be a precedent to allow the president to at least threaten to use military force to get his way. And this is occurring in the middle of an environment known as the filibusters, these Southerners who pro-slavery activists who cross from American territory and attempt to colonize parts of northern Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean basin. Cuba is a favorite target of the filibusters, in the hopes of leading to the annexation of these territories to the United States so they can become a slave state. So in the Buchanan approach, if this plan had worked, and of course it did not because the Paraguayan gambit comes to naught, there would have been an adjustment that would have allowed him to more aggressively use troops in the Caribbean basin and the areas in this map, and that might have paved the way for additional slave states, if a civil war had not occurred. So it was Paraguay was a means to an end rather than an end in and of itself. Question on the Kansas Constitution. This was a good question. I rushed over it too quickly in the snippets. Did the state vote on whether they wanted to be a slave state? Seems like it became a slave state based on popular sovereignty, like Utah and New Mexico. And so, why should there have been upset with Buchanan to allow that to occur? And the backdrop to this is the extraordinary tension around Kansas in the mid 1850s, in the aftermath of passage of Kansas-Nebraska Act. So this is a map from the era, and you can see Kansas as its own color. It's as if it's the center of the political universe. You have slave owners who are racing into Kansas from Missouri. You have anti-slavery activists that are particularly coming from the Midwest and New England that are settling Kansas. And the goal is for each of these groups, who don't really have any connection to Kansas per se, to become a quick majority, get Kansas into the Union as either a free or a slave state. And the slave activists begin first through a constitution that is passed in this building called the Lecompton Constitution, because it was in the city of Lecompton in Kansas. This was a constitutional convention that created a state constitution for Kansas that allowed slavery, but it was perceived as a completely rigged process. The anti-slavery activists in Kansas boycotted the convention. They boycotted the subsequent vote. So this was the constitution that a fraudulent constitution that Buchanan was pushing. The Senate votes in favor of admitting Kansas as a slave state under the Lecompton Constitution, but the House, the Democrats can't get a majority in the House, and they say they want a new vote on this, and there is a second vote in Kansas, and the Lecompton Constitution is overwhelmingly rejected. So basically, the reason why this was so controversial from Buchanan's standpoint is that he was attempting to get Kansas into the Union as a slave state, even though everyone knew that this Lecompton Constitution was a fraudulent document, that it did not reflect the real beliefs of Kansas voters. Now, this episode, or this era in Kansas history, Kansas is sometimes called Bleeding Kansas during this period, is a good illustration of why the popular sovereignty doctrine was so flawed, that it basically invited both sides, to extremists from both sides, to rush in and try to create either slave or free states on the fly. Interested in why southern states with large populations of poor white people oppose secession. This is an interesting point. And this is the map that I was talking about in the snippet. So the purple areas in these in this map are states where the counties voted against secession, and that was a tough vote in the time, because the passions of the mob are in favor of secession throughout the South. And so you look at these purple areas, and what do they have in common? They are disproportionately areas consisting of poor rural whites, relatively few slave plantations in any of these areas. So who are these people? They tend to be small landowners, tenant farmers, occasionally merchants. They resent what they see, not incorrectly, as the excessive power of the slave owners, the big slave owners, the plantation owners in southern states. They believe that southern state policy is dictating firmly in their favor, in the slave owners' favor, and not looking out for the interests of the of the non-slave owner portion of the South. And so these are also areas of the South that were disproportionately loyal to the Whig Party, not to the Democratic Party. So they see this, they don't like the way things are going in the South. Important point here. Even though these groups, these areas tended to be pro-union, did not mean they were racially egalitarian. In fact, they were as racist, and in some cases more racist than the areas here in orange. So the debate here was not over equality and civil rights for African Americans. The debate was over power, political power in the South for whites and whites only. And these rural areas, kind of right-wing populist areas, felt that their interests were not being taken care of by the slave owners, and so they were willing to stay loyal to the Union, because if, in the worst case scenario, from the standpoint of the slave owners, if slavery was abolished throughout the South, that would not have affected these rural areas anyway, because the voters in these areas tended not to be slave owners. Regarding Lincoln's ousting of Hannibal Hamlin in favor of Johnson as vice president, why was this such a fateful mistake, and why was Johnson perceived as dangerous? So this is Hannibal Hamlin. He is. I'm from Maine. I'm speaking to you from Maine. I'm a voter up here. This is the closest a Maine resident ever came to being president. But this was a different era. So he is. He's nominated to the Lincoln ticket in 1860 to provide regional balance. So Lincoln's from Illinois, the Midwest. Hamlin is from Maine, New England. Hamlin also had been a Democrat, sort of like John Hale, and had moved over to the Republican Party. He was a Republican senator from Maine before the Civil War. So the idea is that ex-Democrats might feel comfortable voting for Hamlin. This is a pre-modern political environment regarding vice presidential power. So in the 19th century, in the current environment, think Harris in the current administration, or Pence in the previous administration. These were people, or Biden under Obama. These were people who have considerable power in the running of public affairs, even if they're the number two rather than the number one. That was not the case in the 1860s, or really at any point in the 19th century. The vice president was largely a ceremonial office. Hamlin was not a close advisor of Lincoln, but he was basically a mainstream Republican. And so if Hamlin had succeeded Lincoln upon Lincoln's assassination, that is, if Lincoln had renominated him in 1864 and Hamlin would have been vice president when Lincoln was assassinated, it's very likely that we would have seen a reconstruction. I'll be talking more about reconstruction in the lecture snippets for next week. Would have seen a reconstruction that was basically in line with Lincoln's thoughts. Johnson, by contrast, so Hamlin is a Democrat, an ex-Democrat who had moved over to the Republican Party before the Civil War. Johnson, by contrast, was a Democrat. He was a Democratic senator, but from the rural areas of Tennessee, the Unionist areas of Tennessee. He remains loyal to the Union, but he retains the prejudices of these Southern white voters from the 1860s. And so, in terms of of racial discrimination and racism. I mean, it's very hard to sort of juxtapose contemporary attitudes towards racism on the 19th century presidents, because they're all racist by contemporary standards. But Johnson's racism was particularly virulent and particularly pronounced. So rather than getting a president like Hamlin, who would have implemented mainstream Republican philosophy, which may very well have failed in Reconstruction as well, by the way, but at least they would have tried. Instead, what the country winds up getting is someone in Andrew Johnson who was not qualified to be president, and whose core beliefs on the key issue of post-Civil War America, which is the the equality and the need for federal policies to safeguard the equality of the former slaves from the South. His attitude, Johnson's attitude, is simply out of step entirely with the Republican Party as a whole. So the net effect is going to be a president who will serve, who is basically an anti-Republican, even though he had been elected in the Lincoln ticket. So if Hamlin was still vice president and had become president succeeding Lincoln, the subsequent history of Reconstruction would have been significantly different. Again, would Reconstruction have succeeded? I think probably not. But at least there would have been a chance for success. So that's all that we have for this week. Lecture snippets will be going out on Sunday night.